I want you to think of a woman in your life. Your mom, your sister, your best friend. She comes to you expressing a variety of concerns, acne, irregular periods, and excess hair that will never go away. This woman that I just described, along with 20% of women around the world, suffers from a hormonal and reproductive disorder called polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS. Now, women with PCOS not only experience these symptoms, but they face higher rates of infertility and a twofold higher risk of heart disease, already the leading cause of death for women in the United States. Now, the woman that I asked you to think about, she does everything right. She consistently exercises, eats right, and doesn't smoke. And yet, as she goes throughout her day, while at her favorite workout class, sitting at her desk, or making dinner, her blood vessels are adapting to changes in pressure and flow. Now, one way that your blood vessels adapt is by relaxing, or vasodilation. This response is controlled by a specific sensor in the walls of your blood vessels, called beta-adrenergic receptors. Think of these receptors as automatic doors. When working properly, they open wide to let blood flow easily, so your heart doesn't have to work as hard. But what happens if these doors don't open like they should? In women with PCOS, we think these receptors aren't working properly, putting them at higher risk for heart attack or stroke. So we hypothesized that when we directly stimulate these receptors, women with PCOS would have a decreased response in the form of decreased blood flow compared to the controls. To test this, we use a technique called skin microdialysis that allows us to locally infuse two drugs, isoproterenol to relax and propranolol to constrict. By testing women with and without PCOS, we're able to see if the same drugs are able to produce same or different responses. Now, the figure on the right is our skin data. On the x-axis, we have our baseline where there's no drug infused, isoproterenol to relax, and propranolol to constrict. And on the y-axis, we have our skin blood flow. Now, statistically, there's no difference between these data, which is different than our hypothesis that we would see a difference here. But the goal of research is to seek the truth. And the truth is that these beta-adrenergic receptors seem to be intact in women with PCOS and may not be contributing to their increased risk of heart disease. This research is going to direct future research to figure out what does. So the woman that I asked you to think about, she is not an outlier. Her heart may already be working harder than it should, and she deserves research that reflects her body, her risks, her future. So by understanding how these beta-adrenergic receptors function in women with PCOS, we move closer to improving long-term heart health for millions of women. Thank you.
What do a 91-year-old art teacher living in Salem, an 8-year-old ex-convict and Vietnam veteran living in Springfield, and me, a history student at the University of Oregon, have in common? We're all connected to Project Newgate. Project Newgate was the nation's first federally funded prison education and reentry program. And it was sponsored here at the University of Oregon and held at the Oregon State Penitentiary from 1967 to 1974. No existing scholarship exists on Project Newgate. So, my history thesis uncovers the history of Project Newgate through 3 chapters. First, I look at the logistics of the program itself. Project Newgate allowed individuals incarcerated in the Oregon State Penitentiary, the maximum security prison, to begin their college education inside prison walls, enter a release house on 1810 Alder Street, and attend classes here at the University of Oregon. To conduct that research, I looked at University of Oregon special collections as well as the Oregon Historical Society. And that led me to the second chapter, which was the professors, the individuals who had a direct impact on the incarcerated students as they taught classes ranging from introduction to logging to drawing 101. In order to conduct the second chapter, I interviewed the 91-year-old art teacher living in Salem, and she gave me a document from her garage, her original collection of her Newgate document, and that is what led me to John Doe. He's a resident of Springfield, and he was a student in Project Newgate in 1972, and I conducted an oral history interview with him. So, Project Newgate clearly impacted each of these players' lives, from the students, the administrators, as well as the instructors. Where does that put me into this? I'm an intern for the University of Oregon's prison education program. So the legacy of Project New Eight continues today, despite its relatively short lifespan. So my goal of this historical research is not only as a historian, but also as someone trying to bring the story of Project New Eight to light by highlighting the oral histories of the individuals most directly impacted by it, and hopefully doing John Doe and the 91-year-old art teacher justice. So as I continue on my journey as both a historian and as someone trying to implement this in the university's history, my goal is to bridge together the 91-year-old art teacher, the 85-year-old ex-convict in Salem, and myself, so we can create a more just future in prison education. Thank you.
Tidal marshes are a vital ecosystem, providing the second most ecosystem services and carbon capture potential of any habitat type around the world. Yet, they are under a lot of stress. Despite being crucial for our fight against climate change, both ecosystem degradation and development has destroyed most of them around the world and here in Oregon. However, there is hope on the horizon with restoration projects becoming more and more common, and my thesis focuses on an excellent example of those restoration projects, the Noleston unit of the abandoned marshes in Barnett, Oregon, which was, at the time of construction, the single largest restoration project in the state of Oregon's history. My thesis aims to uncover the land use history, specifically how different modes of land use have altered the biological, geological, and ecological trajectories of the site. The site itself that I chose was interesting for a number of reasons. First off, the land use history is very complicated. This series of maps depicts some of it, with it starting as an indigenous settlement where the coastal would alter the different pathways for fishing. Then it moved into the Euro-American colonization, a heavy logging and mining area, followed by being diked and dammed to be turned into a dairy farm. So it has a quite interesting history, as well as having a number of tsunamis and other flooding events that could reset the progression throughout its time. I'm very excited about this work, partially because of how novel it is. It's very rare to use biogeochemical methods within a restoration ecology idea. And so I was excited to get to go out and take a number of soil cores, all of those along that transect, which were then put through an X-ray fluorescence processor, which measures trace elements, which are elements with minute levels in the soil, as well as carbon, both inorganic and organic. That data has the potential to tell you anything from the inundation in the marsh to the history of primary productivity to even the different industrial usages in the area. So quite exciting data, and I have only had the data for a few days, but initially there's been a lot of results indicating that there has been quite a bit of change from colonization, specifically reducing the inundation and increasing the various industrial chemicals within the renewed swamp. But this is very helpful data for us and can be used not just to look at the history of the site, but also to judge how future restoration projects should take place, both how to initiate them and how to evaluate the site itself in order to make the most effective restoration possible. So I'm very excited about the implications for evaluating future restoration projects that can come from a project like this. Thank you.
6 weeks after a traumatic bone injury, a patient walks into the hospital thinking they're healing, but they're not. An infection has been silently spreading, and by the time the doctors catch it, it may already be too late. My name is Auveen Hajar, and today I want to talk to you about my thesis work on infections and bone fractures. Infection is the causative factor in 38% of fractures that fail to heal, and often that leads to amputation. That means that a person with a job, hobbies, family responsibilities is now without a limb. So why is infection so hard to catch? Because today, we don't have a reliable early detection system. Unlike for a fracture, which you can easily detect on an x-ray, an infection hides. And the blood tests that physicians use to diagnose infection, well, often they're vague. A general white blood cell count, for example, it can rise because of a severe infection, or because of something as simple as a cold. And what that means is that physicians are often left waiting until the symptoms show up. This is 6 to 12 weeks. And by that point, valuable time has been lost. But what if the body knows an infection is coming weeks before those symptoms show up? And what if we could detect that? In a multi-hospital clinical study spanning Indiana, New York, and Oregon, we tracked patients who experienced severe tibial fractures over the course of 1 year. We collected blood from them at time points right before surgery and at 4 time points after. And we didn't just look at vague general signals. We looked at specific immune markers, like T-cell subtypes and myeloid cells. And then we trained a machine learning algorithm to recognize patterns from the data, and here is what we found. Using just 2 of those time points, so one right before surgery and 2 to 4 weeks after, we were able to completely segregate which individuals would go on to heal and which individuals would go on to experience an infection, weeks before doctors can do it today. What this means is that infection isn't something that suddenly shows up late in recovery. It's a process quietly shaping the immune system early in recovery. And for the first time, we can see that happening. This has the potential to change the way that we treat these patients today. Instead of waiting and reacting, doctors can proactively identify high-risk patients, change treatment plans, and ensure that complications are addressed weeks before symptoms show up. So I take you back to that patient who walked into the hospital 6 weeks after their injury. They thought they were healing. Well, next time, we're not going to have to wait for their symptoms to show up, because we will already know an infection is coming. You see, in medicine, time, it isn't just important. No. For these patients, it's everything. Thank you.
We are here today in Eugene, Oregon, a city with the highest per capita rate of homelessness in the United States. This is not an issue that just affects us here in Eugene. Across the U.S., more than 750,000 people experienced homelessness on one night last year. Homelessness is defined as a lack of access to regular, fixed, and adequate nighttime shelter, but will often come with challenges with resource insecurity and poor health as well. But the actual challenges and consequences of homelessness are poorly understood, particularly in the academic literature. My thesis is a part of the homelessness policy and health project based here in Eugene, Oregon, that aims to address this gap. We surveyed over 400 people in our community that were living unsheltered, outside in tents, or in temporary shelter, like the huts you could see on the slide behind me. We asked them about their life experiences, we took them through surveys, we looked at health data, but my analysis is going to focus on food insecurity. And I want to share a result on the prevalence of food insecurity we found, and also if we saw that SNAP, our nation's leading supplemental nutrition program, was able to help address food insecurity in the sample. So first, we found that 85% of those we surveyed experienced food insecurity, 6 times greater than the prevalence in the general U.S. population, but interestingly, significantly more than the 57% average prevalence that we find in comparable studies among people experiencing homelessness. We believe that this is a geographic issue, where most of these studies were conducted in urban centers, and we conducted our study here in a mid-sized city in Eugene, where resources are more spread out, grocery stores are harder to get to, and the local government has less resources to address both food insecurity and homelessness. Additionally, 90% of our sample received SNAP payments, but 86% of them were still food insecure, and this wasn't different with those who received SNAP versus not. We think this is a design mismatch in the program, where SNAP is designed for those who have access to food cooking, preparation, and storage infrastructure, all of which those in our sample completely lack. And so we recommend that there are increased payments for those experiencing homelessness, we decrease barriers, and we also allow people to purchase things like hot food to make these programs more accessible. Unfortunately, federal policy is moving in the wrong direction. Right now, people experiencing homelessness no longer have work exemptions for SNAP. But we can repeal these changes. The QR code behind me will lead you to a page where you can contact your legislator and ask them to change these new rules to SNAP. And I also encourage you to support organizations like Neighbors Feeding Neighbors here in Eugene that are ensuring we all have access to the basic right of food that we deserve. Thank you.
Music therapy is a burgeoning form of art therapy that utilizes music to therapeutic ends. And I'm speaking very broadly because the field is very broad. Many different disorders are targeted and many different interventions are utilized, and this is especially true for treating depression and anxiety. The purpose of our experiment was to find a way to personalize care. That is, match a person with the intervention that would work best for them. And for music therapy, what better way to do this than consult someone's musical identity? Now, using pre-existing literature, we frame musical identity in three components. First, we have experience, which deals with musicianship and training. Next, we have self, which deals with role and social formation and identity. And lastly, we have emotion, which deals with emotional effectiveness. Now, we created a brief inventory of items related to these components and surveyed over 1,200 people. Then we did a fancy statistical test, which is actually not that fancy. It's called a factor analysis. And what it does is measure shared variance between variables. You can think of it as grouping questions into categories based on how related they are. And while we hypothesized 3 groups, the test came back with 2, lumping self and emotion into one, which you can see on there. And that makes sense. They're very related constructs. Here are some of the other outcomes from our survey. We found that scoring high on these 2 scales was associated with younger age and high rates of depression and anxiety. On the clock, I can't get into it, but during the break, you might want to ponder with a neighbor why you think it is, because it's pretty interesting. Next, using these components, we can create this graph and then place someone on this graph based on what they score on our survey. And then we can hypothesize what kind of intervention would work best for them. So people in this top right quadrant who indicate they are musicians and to score high in self and emotion, we recommend therapeutic songwriting because we can utilize their experience, but it's also very emotional. However, for people in the bottom right, we recommend receptive therapies because these people might not be musicians, they might not want to play music, but they can still respond to the emotional aspect of that therapy. And we have similar rationales for the other 2 quadrants. Now, it's important to emphasize that many different factors go into deciding what intervention to use, and it's still unsure about exactly how we can use this model, but we believe it to have positive effects. Firstly, we hope that tailoring will help increase intervention effectiveness. We also hope that it will democratize care, and what I mean by this is that we all use music therapeutically every day, but music therapy is a very highly structured field, and that can be daunting. So the purpose of this model is to give people the confidence that we can blend structure and rigor of therapy with the magic of personal connection to music, which at the end of the day is what it's all about. Thank you.
I want you all to close your eyes and imagine that you're standing on a vast sheet of bright seafoam lit ice. The ice creaks and groans while the ocean deep below ebbs and flows. You look up in the sky, and Jupiter hangs 8 times larger than how the moon looks from Earth. You are standing on one of Jupiter's icy moons, Europa. You can open your eyes. Humans are oral storytellers, and for generations, we have passed down our knowledge, creativity, and our traditions through stories. As our species has evolved, so has our storytelling mediums and subject areas. While most of us here probably love to sink our teeth into scientific topics, only 17% of Americans are consuming science news on a weekly basis. We are facing a science literacy crisis in our country, and our current models of science communication are not reaching these science-averse audiences. Research shows that one of the largest barriers to science communication is a lack of emotional connection that audiences have with a subject. Essentially, they ask, why should I care about this? In contrast, true crime podcasts like Serial are enthralling. They draw people in. They have these characteristics of emotional connection that is so strong that audiences just can't let go. And they do this through several narrative components, such as audioscapes, casual language, and the blend of hard fact with subjective commentary, which is what makes a story relatable and memorable. I am a storyteller, journalist, and a lover of icy moons. And in 2024, I had the opportunity to travel to the launch of NASA's Europa Clipper mission, which is traveling 400 million miles to Jupiter's icy moon, Europa, to look for the ingredients of life.
While there, I recorded my experience of sitting through a hurricane, meeting researchers, and seeing the rocket launch. My project is a 5-part podcast series that brings together the components of oral storytelling, true crime podcast, the hero's journey story arc, investigative journalism, and science communication models to tell the story of Europa Clipper. I weave together 4 unique narratives: Europa Clipper's 20-plus year journey, my experience reporting on this, as well as interviews with scientists on Europa Clipper, and my reflection 18 months later. I designed a mirror of Europa Clipper's journey and my own, and take the emotional investment that the audience has with me and pass it on to Clipper. The goal of this project is to make audiences excited about the pursuit of discovery and public science. My creative thesis proposes new strategies to get science-averse audiences engaged in science media, showing science as a story. Thank you.
This past winter was the warmest winter ever recorded in the history of the Pacific Northwest. And despite the low snowfall, despite the dry season, one thing stands out to me. Climate change is here. It's no longer a projection for the future, and it's impacting the systems that we rely on every day. My name is Sam Golden, and as a data scientist here at the University of Oregon, I chose to focus my thesis research on quantifying and understanding that impact within the Oregon energy grid. I built a series of statistical and machine learning models to project how our grid will react under different climate-warming scenarios, and the results are fascinating. However, before we get into them, I need to give you guys some context. This is where I want to direct you to my first figure on the left here. It's a little smaller than I intended it to be, but if you guys notice the y-axis here, you'll see that 4 to 6 degrees of warming is going to be highly likely by the year 2060. And 6, 8, or even 10 degrees of warming is going to be highly likely by the year 100. Now, with that, I want to bring you guys to my main figure in the center here, the temperature and demand relationship. As we can see, energy demand is highly sensitive to the temperature. This is expected, and it's a well-understood relationship across energy grids. However, through my thesis research, I discovered something unique to Oregon. Our grid is what I like to call demand lopsided, and it's also Oregon lopsided. What that means is that as we get these colder temperatures here, we demand more energy, and we source the dirtier energy than we do in the hotter temperatures get here. Simply put, we emit more in the cold than we do in the hot. And with that, I can now bring you guys back to our climate projection with my final figure on the right here. CO2 emissions fall as the climate wars. We see this happening specifically because of the carbon lopsided nature of our grid. What's going on is that the loss of cold days is more significant than the addition of hot days, and hence emissions rise. Now, this is hopefully a breath of fresh air, just a world of values about climate. But it's also an incredibly important finding for 2 distinct reasons. First, it proves that the investments we've made over the last decade have worked. Our grid can genuinely operate limits. And second, it informs us how to build our grid for the future. Energy grids change very slowly. Grid we rely on today was largely planned in the 1990s and the 2000s. And so the grid we rely on 2050 and 2070 needs to be planned right now. But we can't do it without research like this. Thank you guys.
Barnett, and I'm here to talk to you about how for the last 10 years, the nonprofit industry has lost over $1 billion on an annual basis. This is just simply not an okay mechanism for the degree of impact that these organizations are able to have. In my research, I explored if other technologies, such as blockchain and smart contracts more specifically, are actually not only a viable, but more economically efficient option. In my research, I first started looking at how we traditionally run these organizations. From the time that someone like me or you donate, there's anywhere from a 3 to 5 business day period for them to even process your transaction. Between then, your donation is not the amount you're actually thinking that they receive. First, you lose 5 to 7% in fees. Then you have the fact that overhead can range anywhere from 20 to 80% of what they're actually spending on. And then there's also the additional third parties and other administrative fees involved. So if someone donated $10 million, they are losing in the first step of those 5 to 7% transaction fees anywhere from $500,000 to $800,000. So with this, we see that these organizations are already drastically losing out on their impact. When I looked at blockchain, I analyzed 1,000 transactions across 2 networks. The blockchains were Solana and Ethereum. And with this, I had 3 core findings. First, every single transaction from the time that you or I donate to the time they receive it was completed in under 10 seconds with no variations. The next thing I noticed is that if someone donates that $10 million amount, or maybe they're donating 10 cents, there is no variation greater than $1 for that transaction fee. So not only are we seeing that this is faster and more economically efficient, but we're able to not quantify the specific impact. But with those money that you're saving, you're able to see a greater reach of impact. This isn't just a theory. It's already been proven with an organization called the Giving Block, who I not only had the privilege of speaking to, but helping them organize a greater interface. In that time I spoke to them, they talked about how they have already accepted over $125 million worth of payments that have been accepted across 220 different forms of digital currencies, whether it's stable coins or other forms of crypto. This isn't just a financial theory. It's actually a reality about how we can innovate our current processes and methodologies with technology. With this, you're able to use these smart contracts, a simple if-then form. For someone like me who's from Los Angeles, I can specify if I donate to Red Cross, then it will go to wildfire relief. This allows me as the donor to see where my money is going and how it's being spent. And with this, we've seen that if donors know where their money is going, they're more likely to donate. This isn't a question of if we actually do this, but rather when will companies and nonprofits take the next step into securing their financial future to have a greater degree of impact. Thank you so much.
When I say the phrase renewable energy, what images come to mind? Is it a green utopia, tree-lined boulevards with healthy crops and clean water? For many of you, this is probably the case. Everywhere you look, green energy is described as the keystone solution to many of humanity's most critical issues. And while there are real potential benefits to these energy sources, such narratives often overlook the bigger picture. Yes, solar, wind, and hydro, all have been associated with social progress and decarbonization across any number of contexts. However, these energies still carry serious risk of reproducing the same issues we're seeing with fossil fuels. Just look, for instance, at the ongoing lithium extractivism in Chile or the hydroelectric dams in Myanmar. Environmental nonprofits, policy conventions, and NGOs alike often overlook these risks, and in their oversight, end up reproducing the same issues that they claim to supersede. My project both identifies and corrects for these issues of oversight through a comparative historical analysis of Pakistan and Thailand across 3 distinct periods of development. In all, I aggregated data from over 160 different sources, including academic databases, peer-reviewed articles, corporate government reports, and independent research organizations, totaling around 2,500 pages of information since those size. It was through this depth of research that I developed 3 key mechanisms describing the ways in which imperial actors continue to manipulate energy systems historically and at present. But alternatively, I mean to say how corporations or nations control the energy resources of less powerful countries to extract wealth and maintain dependence. Through this depth of research, I inductively developed 3 key mechanisms describing how these actions take place. The first is political and economic shocks, which refers to events in which imperial actors utilize some sort of crisis to enter domestic energy markets and reorient them towards their own interests. The second of these, integration of hegemonic ideals, falls at the introduction of neoliberalism, welfare democracy, and forward-produced propaganda that subordinated the interests of countries with less resources towards those with more. The third and final interacts with these two. Reshaping of energy orientation follows how Western consumerism has affected the energy habits and lifestyles of those living in a non-Western context. Overall, my project breaks ground into new territory, producing novel insights into how historical relationships affect the life cycles of renewables today. Most importantly, the framework developed on my three mechanisms. It can and should be included in ongoing policy discussions to ensure that the ongoing green transition is centered on improving basic human qualities of life rather than increasing the profit of a select few.
Growing up, I was regaled with tales of my grandfather's time as the captain of a fishing vessel, taking yearly trips back and forth from Alaska. Salmon is a huge part of my family's heritage, and the same can be said for countless others across the Pacific Northwest, from the tribes that call the Cascades their home to other children and grandchildren of fishermen. Unfortunately, future generations might not be able to have this experience, as 28 subspecies of salmon are currently protected under the Endangered Species Act. This has done a lot for salmon conservation, but new pitfalls emerge each day that hinder these efforts. One of these pitfalls is known as urban runoff mortality syndrome, which affects coho salmon. It's caused by the chemical 6-PPD quinone, which is a reaction between the tire preservation agent 6-PPD and ozone, which is present in the atmosphere. When tires interact with roadways, little particles wear off and are washed into urban streams, where 6-PPD quinone causes acute mortality in coho salmon. 6-PPD quinone was only discovered in 2021, so its filtration and removal has recently been a hot topic in research. In 2025, researchers discovered a synthetic soil that filtered 6-PPD quinone so effectively that 100% of the coho salmon used in testing survived. Unfortunately, this soil mixture can cause algal blooms if used in excess, so more research is needed to find the most optimal filtration solution. In addition, 6-PPD quinone's parent chemical, 6-PPD, is also an acute environmental contaminant that pollutes terrestrial environments like soils and can even make its way into our food. Volcanic pumice, on the other hand, is a cheap and common material that's an effective filter for many other contaminants. So, I tested the ability of 5 different sizes of pumice. I tested its ability to filter out a solution containing 6-PPD, and then I compared it to the effective synthetic soil. To do this, I pumped my 6-PPD solution through columns and then tested the concentration of the effluent. It turns out that pumice works somewhat. Though it's not as effective as the synthetic soil mixture, that doesn't mean it can't be useful. You can see the percent removed by the 5 different size fractions of pumice, the soil all the way up there, and the control which had nothing done to it to illustrate this point. More work should be done, like combining pumice and soil, testing different concentrations of 6-PPD solution, and testing pumice's ability to filter 6-PPD quinone. My research has contributed to this important topic by testing an understudied chemical with a new filtration medium. Pumice shows promise in the 6-PPD mitigation realm, but more research is needed to find its exact niche and fully protect coho salmon from this pollution issue. Thank you.